Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. This is the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture, as well as Center for Translational Social Neuroscience panel discussion about some interesting work that I have been doing in collaboration with Rev Patti Ricotta, who is also here today. It's been a really interesting twist of my own research plan. So as I was thinking of how I would, what I would say here today, I was reminded of, it was 12 years ago, in around 2010, 2011, I started the Center for Translational Social Neuroscience. And the reason for that, creating that center, was because I really wanted my work, which I'll tell you a little bit about today, on the neurobiology of social relationships, to have some impact for mankind, to have some way of giving back to humanity in some way. And the way I thought about that for almost all the time that I have been here at Emory, which is now 29 years I've been at Emory, for quite a long time, the way that I had been thinking about my work on the neuroscience of social relationships and social behavior, the translational impact of that was for maybe helping treat social deficits and psychiatric disorders such as autism. So it was more of a medical bent. But this all changed. I mean, I still think that way, and I'm still working really hard to try to help make improvements for social functioning and psychiatric disorders of all kinds. But today's talk, I'm going to talk about some work that really has changed the direction that I have gone, and it all started with an email contact from Rev Patti Ricotta. So Rev Patti and I have been teaming up to do this really important work, and we are really an unlikely duo. Okay, Patti is a reverend. She's a member of the clergy, and I am not. I'm a scientist. So I think really mainly through the lens of science, and she thinks from also biology, but also theology. So I want to, let me share my screen now so that I can, okay, yeah. Okay, so this is the work that we've been doing now in Africa. I just want to say, okay, yeah. So what we've been doing basically is using my science of love and bonding to bring new perspectives to social relationships, health, and practice of FGM in Eastern Africa. So I just want to say a little bit about FGM, and actually today, after my talk, we're going to have a panel discussion with Dr. Kathryn Yount and from the School of Global Health and Public Health, and also Dr. Mel Konner, who is in the Department of Anthropology. So I really wanted to get some discussion from different perspectives, because my perspective really comes from the neuroscience. So let me just introduce a little bit the idea of FGM. FGM is a practice that occurs in several places around the world. In several Middle Eastern countries, it is practiced, but it's also practiced in many places in Africa. FGM stands for female genital mutilation, and it is a practice that has roots mostly in culture, I think, historical practices. It's not really aligned to religion, although sometimes it can be in some ways. And I have to say that Kathryn Yount has been working with FGM from an academic standpoint a lot longer than I do, so I hope that she can bring in some perspectives on this at the end. But this map just shows you that in certain countries, especially the work we've been doing has been in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. This suggests that around 25 to 50% of women have experienced this FGM, female genital mutilation practice. And this typically happens when the girls are around marrying age, and it is kind of a rite of passage a lot of times. It's sort of, once they have had this procedure, then it is time for them to get married in many cases. But although this map shows that 25 to 50% of females, women in these areas have had this female genital mutilation practice done to them, in local areas, it's much higher concentration. So we've been in areas where it's up to 90%. So it's a pretty widespread practice, and it's illegal in most places, maybe in every country in Africa, I'm not sure. But even though it's illegal, all that has done is to cause this practice to be done, to be hidden. And it is still practiced based on our experiences. So what I'm going to do now is let Patti talk a little bit about how she got connected with me and my science, and then my science.
First, I just want to say hello to everyone. Thank you for being here, whether you're in the room or watching online. It's a real privilege to be working with Larry and to be part of Emory, because my story is now part of his story, and these things are growing. So I have been working in East Africa for almost 20 years, and I started out working by sharing information from the Bible that shows that God intended men and women to be equal. And I know that's not something a lot of people know because it has a lot to do with translation and so forth. But I had been teaching at a conference in Kampala, and this man, Reverend Robert Aroni, came up to me during the break because I had just finished teaching about how in Genesis 1:26 through 28, it says that God made man and woman in his own image. And Reverend Robert was really floored by that idea. So he came up and he was like, Patty, you must sit with me. And he says, you have told us something new. He said, we thought that women were made in the image of man and only men were made in the image of women. And so I said, where did you get that idea? And he said, from 1 Corinthians. And I said, but now you understand. And he said, yes, I understand. Women and men are made in the image of God, and they were both given the responsibility to rule over the earth. And I was like, I can go home happy now. But then he said something I was not expecting. He said, because women are made in the image of God, just like men, maybe that means God doesn't want us cutting our girls. And I was taken aback, and he was talking about FGM, female genital mutilation. And I said, okay, so why do you cut your girls? And he looked at me like, are you crazy? He said, because if a girl can enjoy the pleasure of sex, then she won't be faithful. She'll be promiscuous and won't be a virgin for her husband. Or if a wife can enjoy sex, then she will stray from her husband and not be faithful. And I said, okay, so faithfulness is important in marriage. And he said, yeah, of course. And so I said, well, then, Reverend, what do you cut off of the men to keep them from being unfaithful to their wives? And this was a man that I knew. So he was like, okay, I see your point. And then I pushed a little bit and I said, Jesus says that in everything, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he was like, oh, I never thought about it like that. So he said to me, you need to come and speak to the Sabine people because that's who he was working with. And it took 3 years for the bishop to invite me to come, but I finally went and we started this work. Um, and but when when Reverend Robert said this, I knew immediately that I had information that could help people, any people, decide to stop the practice. Because my undergraduate degree is in biology and psychology, and I knew that I understood the reasons why God made that very precious part. And one of the first thoughts that came into my head was Dr. Larry J. Young, because of this paper that he wrote. And I had read that paper in 2004, and I loved most of all this one sentence. I don't know if you can see it very well, but plasma oxytocin levels are elevated at the time of orgasm in women. So I knew that if people understood that when a woman has an orgasm, her husband releases this massive dose of oxytocin in her called the bonding hormone, and it bonds the two together in love and faithfulness. So that's when I said, okay, I'll go. And then the next thing I want to talk about is how this works. I'm sorry, this may be triggering for people. Larry, would you hand me my water, please? please don't look if this is something that is upsetting to you. The place where I started working was the region of Sabay in eastern Uganda. And this is how it has been done. Girls go through a mentoring process. They're brought to the village square with men. Everybody's looking, the boys are looking down to see who will be a brave, courageous Sabine girl fit for marriage. And they're all just watching to see what happens. And this woman is called a surgeon, and she has no medical experience whatsoever. But she's been taught by her mother and her grandmother how to be a surgeon. And so she comes, lifts up the poor girl's skirt, cuts off in the Sabine region the girl's labia majora, labia minora, and her clitoris. And then just she has 2 months to recover, and then she is married off to the man her father chooses, usually the man who will give him the highest bride price. So that is what's happening. And girls are more attractive if they don't scream or cry out during the ceremony. But of course, if you do cry or you scream, you may never get married because you'd be considered a weakling. And also, a girl is ridiculed her whole life, her whole entire life, if she makes even a sound. There's no anesthesia, nothing. And some girls bleed to death, and they have myths about why that happened. So when I was thinking about going to, I'd actually been working in Sabay for 7 years when I was asked to come to Finland and give a talk. And I thought I had to get that quote, the one that I showed you about orgasm. And as I was rereading that article, I noticed there was a little blue link at the top with Larry's email address on it. And I thought, this guy should know how important his work is and how it is helping to bring an end to FGM. Because once I started teaching the Bible mixed with um, the science of bonding, people totally understood. They did not want to practice anymore. And even before Larry came to work with me, I would have men come to me after a conference, and or they would even ask in front of everyone, "Now, Reverend, can we put these things back in?" Because they understood that the reason their wives despised sex, so many of them left their husbands when they had the number of children they wanted. So they wanted to find a way to remedy this. And of course, you can't put it back in, but I encourage them that you can be the new ancestors, the ones who help your generation to do what needs to be done, because what the ancestors wanted was strong, faithful marriages. And now you have the science and the Bible, and you have this strong message. And it just caught on like wildfire. And that's why I wrote to Larry. That was in 2018. And I told him what was happening and asked him if he'd like to come with me. And he's such a good sport that he came. I think the the big thing, the thing that's different about what we're teaching than what other people are using is, and people have told me this, what has been used before to try to stop FGM is the mantra of women's rights. And of course that's true. It is a woman's right. But if you don't believe that women deserve to have rights, if you believe that women are inferior to men and are created in order to serve men, you won't listen to that message. And so that's why our message makes such a difference, because it brings together the science of how God created, that's my word, not Larry's, how God created our bodies to work in perfect unity and harmony and to release this hormone oxytocin to bond us together. So I would bring together the Bible and Larry's going to come and talk about this. So it's working, and it's working in ways that there aren't any other organizations that are using this message. And that's why there are thousands of people who decided to stop the practice because of this. So thanks, Larry, for coming.
Yes, let's talk about the efforts that we've been doing since I started going with Patti over there. So I have to say, in the beginning, I was reluctant to join with Patti because she comes from a theological background. She speaks from the Bible, and that's not the kind of message that I necessarily want to give. But what she told me was so compelling that when people heard about this biology of the social behaviors and things like that, it was very compelling, and it had the opportunity to potentially change the way people think about things. So I said, okay, we'll go, but let's speak to some medical professionals as well, go to, have conferences. So we organized conferences where we brought in, we had three different conferences with medical students and staff and hospital workers. And this is one picture from that. But we also went to, so we had these conferences, and I spoke about the biology, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a little bit. And yeah, it really revealed to me that the things that we were doing were impactful and salient to them. And one of the things that emerged is that FGM was only one of the issues that my work was relating to over there. Really, it was also, I learned a lot about partner relationships. There's a very big cultural difference between how men and women relate to each other in a marriage. And that also led to a lot of domestic violence. I've had a lot of people discussing, how big of a problem domestic violence is. And I happen to think that part of that domestic violence problem is related to FGM, perhaps. But there's also issues about parent-child relationships, which is also my work is about. Loving the effect of loving and nurturing babies. But also I could talk about autism. When I talked about autism to the hospital workers and staff, they decided that they would start developing behavioral paradigms there to try to improve social functions. And I was actually able to do a little news spot. I'll just play a little clip from this is the national news in Uganda that played on Sunday night, one of the most watched television stations. But this will give you an idea of
maybe part of another know what a healthy relationship is. Abuse may feel normal to you. There are several kinds of abuse, including physical, sexual, and verbal or emotional. Hurting with words, neglect and withholding affection are examples of verbal or emotional abuse. Scientists, especially those in the field of human psychiatry, are now able to tell through studies that relations are quite key for one to thrive. Professor Larry Young from Emory University has been undertaking similar studies. He said good relationships have the ability to contribute to well-being.
And so I've been doing research to try to understand what goes on in our brain when we do that. But more recently, I realized that having this loving relationship between partners, your wife, your husband, actually has important implications for your health. It increases your immune system so you can fight infectious disease. It decreases cardiovascular problems, heart disease. It protects you against cancer. So it's really just amazing how this positive, loving relationship between couples really improve our health. So that became quickly, a message that I went with is that, this is good for everyone. One of the things that I felt a little bit also worried about was trying to go over and impose my values, my ethics onto their culture, my culture onto their culture. And so that's one of the things that I really wanted to avoid. But as I learned more about the practice of FGM and talked to many more women, I realized that is probably not an issue. I mean, it is an issue that we can maybe discuss later, but the women who have experienced this FGM have really suffered quite a traumatic experience, and then a lifetime of not being able to have a pleasurable sexual relationship with their husband, which I'll tell you in just a moment is really important for creating that bond and also creating the health that allows you to live a long, healthier life. So we went to Sabay and spoke. So our strategy is not to speak to just to individuals, but to try to pick community leaders. So here in the Sabay, with the first conference that we did, these were tribal chiefs, government leaders, and clergy, members of the clergy, both Christian and Muslim. And so we just went there and I gave the talk about my science. And we were not coming in as outsiders on our own. Every time we give a talk there, we have someone from the community or someone in the area to give a talk. And this woman who is speaking here is Damali. She is a registered nurse, but also her and her husband, who is a gynecologist, they own some hospitals in Kampala. And she was the one that was really speaking about FGM. I tried to stay pretty much away from speaking specifically about FGM, but really talking only about the biology of relationships. But I just wanted to show you this because this is one of the slides that she showed there. These are the tools, these are the instruments that they use to do the genital cutting. And they're not sterilized whatsoever. And this is actually, as she described it, this is a mixture of, I believe, red brick and corn flour that they use to actually be able to grip the clitoris to pull it so that they can do the cutting. And you can imagine that is not sterile whatsoever. And they have these beliefs that if a girl dies from bleeding, from being cut, that it is because that girl looked at a boy lustfully at some point in her youth. So, but the thing that really struck me after that very first conference was that after I talked, we had both. This is a group of people that were at that first conference. There's a couple of Muslim imams there, as well as Catholic, or not Catholic, Anglican priests. They came together to hear the science about love and bonding. And so to me, that was really cool. And they all were equally enthusiastic. There was not a single person there that I've met in all of the conferences that we've done, which we've now done like 11, I believe, who came to me afterwards and said that they do not believe what I talked about here. And so this was the first conference that actually we sponsored at Emory University. This was done at St. Paul's University, right outside of Nairobi. And there were 400 people there. And the cool thing is that these people that attended this conference came from 5 or 6 hours away. They drove across Kenya. And that was something that we facilitated with funding to be able to pay for the transportation as well as the rooms and food and things like this. But they came for this 2-day conference to hear us talk. And these, again, are members of the clergy. We encourage people to bring their wives, but they're also psychologists, marital therapists, and things like this. And one thing I want to mention too, going back to Sabay, Sabay is in West Uganda. After we left, we heard the people reports that the priests, when they counsel couples, so 90% of the people there are either Christian or Muslim. And when they are now counseling their priests, they talk about they're counseling their couples that are getting married. They talk about oxytocin and the importance of things like looking into the eyes and making eye contact and social touch and all these kinds of things. So it really is grabbing hold there. But the cool thing is that these are all leaders, so they can all reach out to many more people, and we give them our slides. So they're now giving these talks into the community themselves. Another interesting thing is this is a picture of a bishop and a group of priests that come from Meru, which is around Mount Kenya in the center of Kenya. They came 5 hours. They drove 5 or 6 hours that day. After the conference there, then they invited us to come back this year. So we were just there in January, spoke to another 300 to 400 people, totally different people than we spoke to in the first time. So the message is really getting out to large numbers of people. This year, we also went to Tanzania, And we went to a safe house in Tanzania that is a safe haven for little girls who are running away from both being cut, but also the domestic violence that comes with that in that area. And this conference we organized, and here, these guys that are sitting at this table are the cultural leaders. They are trying to keep the cultural customs alive, but they came to hear this talk as well. So one of the things that we did at this conference, because we wanted to learn from them, why is FGM valuable to you? Why do you practice this? And these are just, so we got them to break up into groups. Husbands and wives were split up. They communicated and they reported back to us why FGM is important for girls and women, you know, from the women's perspective. And the answers, most common answers, it's a rite of passage. It is marking a certain age when it is a, you know, time to be married, becoming adulthood. But also that the women actually had heard that it was to help maintain fidelity because it makes sex so painful. Women are not going to be wanting to have sex with others because it is painful. It's also a sign of bravery and a sign of courage. And it also brings honor to the family. So this is why the women do it, or this is why women think that it is important to do it to their daughters. When asked the men, boys and men, why it's important for the girls or their wives to be cut, one of the comments that people that the men mentioned here is that the boy or the young husband doesn't have to worry about bringing pleasure to the girl during sex because that can be humiliating if he cannot bring her to orgasm. If she has this gear, if she has this sexual organ that makes sex be so pleasurable. They also just saying things like it can get in the way during sex. It makes it easier for the boy. So everything was from the boy's perspective of making sex more enjoyable to the boy, but not very much from the girl's perspective. And of course, they also talk about ensuring fidelity, and also husbands would be proud to be married to a cut girl. These are some of the things that they told us was important in the community. At this conference in Tanzania, we also had the surgeons, some of the surgeons that were actually doing the surgery. And this is a group of women that do the surgery. And this lady actually, after the conference, gave a testimony about the fact that she was cut as a young girl. She had a problem with her marriage, with her having a baby. She had to go to the emergency room and all of that. And then after hearing us talk, she had tears in her eyes, thanking us for giving them that information. And I just wanted to, so, you know, some of the comments that people gave about, you know, the clitoris being in the way as an obstacle for having sex, or also relating FGM to circumcision, I made a point to show them this picture. A lot of also people think that the clitoris is a male part that's in a female body. And so I wanted to also make the point that it's not. But before birth, males and female genitals look the same. And this part, in a boy, because of testosterone, will grow into becoming a penis. And whereas the female part, it will develop into the vagina. And so a circumcision, I wanted to make the point, is simply cutting the foreskin away from this, whereas removing the clitoris is like removing the entire penis. And I think that was pretty compelling to them too. But I just wanted to, just a few days ago, we got a newsletter, a report back from one of the conferences, and I just wanted to read some of this stuff because this is kind of what has made me feel like, you know, I'm not really imposing my culture on other people, but they also really want to change. So for example, this is from the Meru region where the bishops or some member of the clergy wrote this, that said 75 out of 100 girls and women are cut either willingly or unwillingly in this area. 75%. It's done even to women as old as 30 or 40 who get married without being cut. There are times for when they go off to get firewood in the forest or to gather water. And the circumcisers will actually, you know, grab those women and do it using those unsterile and dirty tools. And often there is bleeding. So here you can see this is real. This is not just a cultural practice that's harmless. This is something that really is causing damage to people. In December alone, 60 women were cut in that single area. Okay. This has also struck me as kind of being very interesting. This is from a man's perspective. A man said this. We're in a cultural prison whereby we are forced to marry only cut girls because of societal norms. We are forced to cut our daughters against our will just to fulfill our cultural beliefs. Truly speaking, we do not like to cut women because they are like an empty shell. And this is something that, you know, I heard over and over and over again when talking to women about their sexual experiences. They just simply have not the idea that sexual relationships with their husband generates pleasure. So I just now want to talk a little bit about my science so that you can understand why the science that we've been doing here at Emory relates to these issues that I've been talking about. So I was very careful when I started out my talk that I learned from nature. I'm a biologist. I'm not going to say anything that comes out of the Bible. I'm going to speak about what we've learned from nature and from different animals. And so these are the animals that I work on. These are called prairie voles. I have a colony of these here at Emory over at the Emory Primate Center. And what makes them a great model for studying monogamy and social relationships is these guys, once they mate, they form a bond that lasts a lifetime generally. They raise offspring together. And we're able to study the neurochemistry and the neuropsychiatry of that process. And one molecule, I'm going to talk about two molecules that everybody that we spoke to at all of these conferences can remember these two molecules. One is called oxytocin, because half of the members in the audience had experienced oxytocin when they give birth. If they were mothers, they'd give birth. Oxytocin is a molecule that's made in the brain, goes to the uterus at the time of birth, and it causes the uterus contractions, causes the labor, and causes the birth to happen. It's also the molecule that when the mother is nursing her baby, so the baby begins to suckle, it's released and goes to the breast to cause the milk to be ejected. So this happens in all mammals. This oxytocin molecule is responsible for those two things. But what we also know is that it is acting in the brain at the same time to focus that mother's brain on that baby, on the cues of that baby, on the face, on the smell, to create a very strong bond between that mother and that baby. And I had this video that a friend, our driver in Uganda, gave us. This is gorillas up in Bwindi. I haven't seen them yet, but I want you to just take a look at how gentle this mother gorilla is when she's nursing this baby. And this kind of connection, and this is also how I was able to convey to them that humans and animals have a lot of similarities. We have a lot of the same, we have almost all the same brain parts. We've got the same neurochemistry, and that oxytocin that is being released into that mother and going into her brain is causing that bond. That is the same molecule that creates a bond between male and female, husband and wife, mates in different species as well. And so I, talked about, how when that mother is nursing that baby, her brain is focused on that baby and she's learning everything she can about that baby, all of the features of that baby. I use the example of these zebras that, all the baby zebras look the same to us, but if a mother zebra is giving birth, she learns quickly the stripes of her baby and she nurses her baby and she will defend that baby and she'll risk her life to save that baby, but she will not nurse other babies. So it's a molecule of bonding. And that's a very faithful process. That bonding is very faithful. So everybody could understand that process. And so the other key element to this oxytocin is that, oxytocin not only causes the bond between the mother and the offspring, but also between these animals, between these voles. So you can inject oxytocin into two animals, even if they don't mate, you can induce this bond between them. And the other key element is that where oxytocin is acting, this is an area called the nucleus accumbens. It's the brain's reward pathway. It's the area that's involved in addiction. It's where dopamine acts to create pleasure, reward, and addictions. And it turns out that this is where oxytocin acts to create the bond between partners. And in fact, this slide is also to show that animals that do not bond, unfaithful animals, do not have oxytocin receptors in that area. So they actually learned a little bit of neurochemistry in this, but I emphasize that if you look in the human brain also has oxytocin receptors in this nucleus accumbens area. And those oxytocin receptors are activated and activate the nucleus accumbens, the same brain area, when men look at photographs of their partner. I'm not going to be able to show all of the slides that I showed then, but it really made a compelling message. So the chemistry of bonding is not just oxytocin. Oxytocin is what makes the of the baby salient. There's also another molecule that's really important, and that is dopamine. So the sexual interaction, the interaction between the male and the female has to be pleasurable in order for this chemical cocktail. So it's a cocktail that has to happen. It is, you have to have clarity of vision of your partner, a perception of your partner, but also you have to have that reward, that reinforcement. And then that bonding is kind of like an addiction to a partner. And that is something that I think because of the lack of pleasure in sex, women were telling us that when the men want sex, they just demand to have sex right then, and there's no pleasure whatsoever. It's part of their duty to have sex, to have children, but it's not part of that relationship. And so this is something that they are all missing. Yet every woman that I talked to really wanted that in their life. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add that when Larry is talking, this man has a superpower, okay? Actually, he's got two superpowers. One is that even though he's a scientist and doesn't ever mention anything about the Bible, he has such respect, not only for me, but for all of the people that we serve. And because you can't reach people if you cut off half of their brain and say, okay, you do what I tell you to do because this is women's rights. But they're going, if you have a strong belief, then you need to address that as well. And so one of the things that I appreciate, because he said he was worried about working with me, I was worried about working with him too. Because he could say something that could undermine all the work I've done, because I'm trying to build relationships of equality between men and women from the biblical perspective. And there is a biblical perspective, but I was really worried about it. But he has such respect and pays attention to every single person that he's talking to. It's like, it's very clear that all he wants to do is help people with his science. And they absorb it because there's nothing fake about him. He's very authentic. And that's part of it. But also, I know he's going to show the picture of he and Anne, his wife. But when men say things like, oh, I just want to, just use her, Larry goes, are you kidding? I do anything to make my wife happy. I enjoy making my wife happy. And the men are totally stunned. They're like, what? And he's American, he's a this, he's a that, he's a that. And the women just melt. They're like, oh, so that's one of his superpowers, that he can be so authentic and respectful of my spirituality and the people we work with. Larry Young's other superpower is that the man will eat anything. And people love to watch him eat. The way to someone's heart is through the food they present to you. But he can eat it all, and I appreciate that. Is a real superpower.
Talking about the food that they serve at the conference.
Yeah.
I eat all the food it's all great.
Not just that, he goes to the market. Oh, I had so many pictures, but we don't have time. But if you ever want to see the pictures of what this man will eat, it makes it easier, because sometimes when I bring people with me, they don't want to eat the food and they're, ew, you know, and it's hard because these people have used a lot of money to be able to provide that meal. So Larry just eats it all and asks for seconds. So just thought I'd put that in.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to just continue with a little bit of the science, because a lot of these messages I think are important. And, you know, I make I emphasize the point that oxytocin is not just a mother hormone. It's not just in women. It's both in men and women. And oxytocin is a molecule that's really involved in us connecting with others, okay? And it's important in society. Everybody wants their children to be healthy and be able to be highly connected to other people. And oxytocin is a molecule that helps us not only bond, but really to connect to others and to be able to form relationships. And this is being successful. So I much about FGM, right? Yeah, started talking, but rather about, you know, other things that I think are really, really important to people. So this is just another way, you know, I use these kind of visuals that I think are very compelling. I use the same one in every talk that I give, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, or there in the Bay. But the idea is that, you know, if you think about a computer screen, there's noise there. Even if there's an image behind there, if there's a lot of static in there, you don't really perceive what that image is. But if you had a dial that could turn down the noise, so to increase the signal, then you can see the cues there. And that's what oxytocin does in the brain. That's what we've learned through hardcore neuroscience research here at Emory, as well as in other places. And if that cue is a social cue, then we can use that information to be to help us to others. But again, related to bonding, okay, the two most potent stimulators of oxytocin release are nipple stimulation that occurs during nursing, and also vaginal cervical stimulation that occurs during birth. But those two things also in humans happen during sex. So I think that our biology is sort of organized to activate this maternal bonding circuitry, both in men and women, to create the bond between the partners. But also important is social touch and eye gaze. So one of the things that we learned over there in terms of couple relationships is that in many of these places, maybe not so much in the Kampala in the city, but especially in the rural countryside, men do not want their wives to look at them in the eyes. So they basically don't have eye-to-eye contact. They have very little social touch either. Even when the men are walking down the street, often the women, this is one of the quotes from the leader of the church there in Tanzania, you have a husband is walking, he'll be walking 10 meters in front of the wife and also complaining to her the whole time. And so it's like, you know, this notion that husbands and wives can really relate to each other. It's just a cultural difference that I try to convey, you know, why it is important to maintain those kinds of bonds. We also heard a lot about domestic violence and abuse and things like that. And here's some work that I showed them because it really relates to trauma early in life and neglect. So these are these voles again. And this is work that we did where we were able to take the voles and give them a little social isolation for 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. So they're missing social contact during that time. And what we find is that when they grow up, those animals that had that in neglect have a difficulty in forming bonds later in life. And we know that that has to do with oxytocin signaling early in life, the nurturing or the lack of nurturing that they get, that they are, the nurturing that they're not getting when they are in this neglect paradigm is not building the social circuitry of the brain to be able to form relationships. And so this is where we talk about, you know, parents, you want your child to be able to form relationships. You want them to be, you want to use their natural biology to form bonds. But by doing practices like this, whether it be through abuse, beating, neglect, or FGM, all of these things are sort of going against the biology that helps individuals form these kinds of relationships. And this is another example, I think, remind me to tell about the fathers in the community, in the room. So this is another example showing that in humans, that when parents and fathers play with their children, it releases oxytocin into their brains as well. So this is a study where they took fathers of little babies and gave them either intranasal oxytocin or placebo and told the fathers to play with the child. And then they measured the oxytocin in the father. And of course, if the father sniffed the oxytocin, he had a lot of oxytocin in his saliva. That's not surprising. The placebo, not so much. what they found is that when the fathers got this oxytocin, they played with the baby more. They looked into the eyes more. They engaged. They did reciprocal interaction, mimicking each other, kinds of things. And then when they measured that oxytocin in the infants, they could see that rise in that oxytocin in that infant just through that parental interaction. And this was very compelling to them to make the point that when you have a child, interacting with that child, nurturing that child day in, day out throughout its development, it can help build its brain in such a way that it will be adapted into the social environment and it can be successful. So I try to talk about how to, create children that will then themselves be successful. Oh yeah, so at the conference in Meru, there was probably 4 or 5 fathers there. And before I gave this slide, the mothers were holding the babies. The fathers were not even looking at the babies, not doing anything. They were even sitting in different places in the room. But later on in the conference, after I gave this lecture, we could see the fathers were carrying their babies everywhere. So just having that information change it. It's not that it's against their culture to do that, but it's the lack of knowledge. So I really feel that what we're doing there is giving knowledge, not telling them what they should or should not do, but give them the knowledge so that they can change their own behaviors the way that they feel is helpful to their children. Here's another example that comes from the work that we've done here. And I won't show you the vole work here I did there, but basically what we find is that in the voles, if they are pair bonded and then they're separated from their partner and they lose their partner, they become depressed. They give up under difficult situations. They fail to thrive almost. They release stress hormones. And this is even just from being separated for an X number of days. And so, I talk about how oxytocin and dopamine together help create the bond, but now I move into talking about the importance of that bond for your mental health as well as the physical health. And this is where I talk about the picture of my wife. And so I talk about the 2 phases of bonding, and that, that this missing the partner when you're away from your partner is probably a mechanism of maintaining the bond for a long period of time. So this is a picture of my wife when we got married about 15 years ago, maybe a little more, 18, yeah. But on the beach of Costa Rica, and around the same time that we got married, we also got this little puppy dog. And when we first got married, every day when I would come home from work, both my wife and my puppy dog would be equally excited to see me. But now, this is my wife now, this is the puppy dog now. And every day when I come home from work, my dog is still excited to see me. My wife, not so much excitement, so excitement has faded, and that relationship changed over time. Yet when I'm away from my wife for 2 or 3 weeks, like when I go to these conferences, I miss her very much. And that missing that wife is what creates some negative affect that makes me want to come back home. I could stay there, but I come home to my wife. And so this is something I think that was also very compelling to them. They love that. They love to see talking about my wife there. But I also make the point, there are other studies in these little rodents that show that if they are separated from their partner and you put human lung cancer cells into their body, they succumb to that lung cancer, okay, faster than if they are still bonded. And so there's actually chemicals, we don't quite know how it works, but things are happening in the brain when we're in these relationships that help maintain not only mental health, but physical health. So I tell them, if you want to live a long time, if you want to live a long, healthy life, you can't just be living with someone, okay? But you really need to have a relationship with that person that helps foster this. And this is the biology's, the system that has emerged in biology to make individuals healthy. Humans, for example. So cardiovascular disease, and I think that the median lifespan there is like 58 years old. And, part of that is maybe because they don't have these relationships. I remember talking to some of the individuals there where, in one tribe you might have, you have the cutting, but you also have monogamy or polygamy with multiple wives. So maybe after 45 years of age or something, the husband would get a new wife or whatnot. But other tribes, they don't do that. And I think it would be a really interesting study to see if they live longer. And that's the kind of research that can come from this, in the same areas, but having different practices. can you actually increase the lifespan of people there? But I think it's very clear to me that you would increase happiness because the relationship is really a contract. And that contract seems to be over when she is no longer fertile, when she goes through menopause, and then she would often the husband would gain another wife. So I ended my talk with a slide like this, my advice for having a long and strong marriage was think of ways that will increase oxytocin and dopamine in your husband or wife. Looking into the eyes. Patty did a demonstration, I have some pictures at the end, when making husbands and wives get together and look at each other, and they got so giggly. And, you could see the oxytocin and dopamine being released. I talked about flowers or giving gifts or any of these things that can release dopamine. And the women were all very excited about that. And the men, I think they believed it. So, but also stopping cultural practices that prevent bonding in future generations. One of the comments that I gave in Tanzania was, all cultures have practices that are somehow damaging and wrong. And so, example, in my culture, we eat certain kinds of foods that are, high sodium pork, salt cured pork. I stopped doing that. That was my culture because I learned from information about how that was detrimental for my health. And so I tried to get them to think in the same sort of ways, and then learn from nature. And then I would end with this slide. And Patty thought I should put that in there because that shows, me and my wife together enjoying each other. And I think that had a big impact on everyone as well. So just end with a few more pictures here before we then go into a panel discussion. But this is the conference that we did. These are all school teachers. Or school teachers and psychologists and counselors. These are people that interact with young people. And so this gentleman who's standing over to the side, that he's an interpreter. So we usually had to have an interpreter, a local person to do the interpretation. And I'm not sure what he was talking about here. Everyone seemed to be enjoying it. But one of the things that he said that after he saw my lecture last year, was he is a chief of Delmart Mangusha, who is a chief in a local area. So that means he's kind of like county commissioner or something of a large area. And he had, people, little boys in his community that were, drinking alcohol all the time, cheap homemade alcohol. They were being, basically, breaking laws and not doing anything for themselves. And after hearing the talk about how, the nurturing releases the oxytocin and it helps build the social structures and stuff, he just simply changed this practice of dealing with those guys and showed them some love. And he said that worked miracles. So just changing, rather than doing only punishment, trying to activate the dopamine and the oxytocin system, is just changing the way that you interact with others. And he started doing it in his office and everything. So that was pretty cool to hear about. We also went this time, this was in Tanzania. This was a safe house that I mentioned early on. And these are little boys and girls who had been running from either cutting or also the domestic violence. So I was really shocked at how much domestic violence and how often the domestic violence came up. And this is one of the things that psychologists and counselors really focused a lot on, was that there's a lot of domestic violence, and they think it is because there's a lack of real sort of connection between the husbands and the wives. And then this is Patty's strategy. I don't know, do you want to talk about this, Patty? This is the last two slides, I think.
I'll be quick, but one of the things that adds to the impact of the science is that I match it with scriptures from the Bible that talk about equality. And a lot of people know that the Bible says that women were created to be helpers to men, but there's the word after that. It's not speaking about an assistant, somebody who washes your socks and cleans it's a powerful source of help in the image of God. But then the next word is that it's translated as she will be suitable for him. But in the Hebrew, the word is kenegdo, and it's a compound word. It means that the woman was created to be face to face with the man, not behind him, not below him, and not out of sight. So Larry had just given the talk about how gazing into each other's eyes releases oxytocin in each other, and that's a very difficult thing for East Africans women to do. They don't even have permission to look in their husband's eyes. So I said, yeah, but God said that you're supposed to be face to face. So I bring them together and just have the husband stand here and the wife stand here. And I say, now, what can you do when you're face to face that you can't do when you're behind? And they all start giggling, you know, they're like, well, we can talk to each other. We can gaze into each other's eyes. We can kiss. And then finally they get to sex and everybody starts clapping. So they see that the science, the reason God said you're supposed to be face to face with each other is because that's how he made our science. That's how he made our biology to work best. You bond when you look at each other, when you converse with each other. So it's an awful lot of fun to see them put the science together with the Bible. And Larry loves these pictures. So everywhere we go, I do this. And the people have such a great time. And this woman, afterwards, we had lunch. She came up to me and she said, I want to tell you a secret. And I said, okay, what's the secret? And she says, I love my husband. I love him very, very much. And I said, really? I said, that's so sweet. And she said, I love that man. And he loves me too. And it was just a really wonderful thing. Because they're putting this together and they know why they love each other now because they have the science that goes with it. Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so that's all we wanted to show with slides now. I would like to have the panelists, Dr. Yount and Konner, come up. And we're going to sit up front and we're going to figure out how to get this camera. Okay, well, thank you guys for coming and taking part in this. I was really looking forward to getting some other kinds of perspectives because the only thinking that I have done on this is on our trips with the last couple of years. So I'd like to start some kind of dialogue about some of the issues around trying to stop cultural practices like FGM and whatnot. And I know Dr. Yount, you've been involved in this for a very long time, and Mel, you've been thinking about things of this nature for a long time as well. So you're in the Department of Anthropology, and so since you have your microphone is all ready, did you want to start off?
I suggested that I start because I'm not going to talk about myself, but about Molly melching and Tostan mostly. And but I want to say today would have been my mother's 114th birthday. And she was the first of the women that I admired and loved. And I'm sure she didn't know about this, but if she did, she would have been shocked. So I'm dedicating my remarks to her. Tostan is TOSTAN is an organization started by Molly Melching in 1974 in West Africa. So there's no competition going on here because he's in Senegal mostly, and Rev Ricotta and Dr. Young are in Kenya and East Africa, and there's plenty of work for you to do in between if you get interested in this. But her work was eventually supported by the Gates Foundation. Melinda Gates wrote about her in her book, and there's a nice interview online with Melinda Gates. Chelsea Clinton also wrote about her in her book, and thousands of villages have been have given this up as a result of the Tostan program since 1974, and the program is not focused on this. It's a general program of health, especially women's health and promoting women's rights. So it includes education about child marriage and abuse and other things, and they're very they're adamant that they don't take any kind of confrontational approach, and they don't even like to introduce their focus as being on this. Although the other big difference is that you have oxytocin and they don't, and that appears to be a very important lever in teaching and persuading people. After all, what we're talking about here is removal of the only human organ that has no purpose except pleasure and the bonding that is fostered by pleasure, and the operation extends beyond clitoridectomy to cutting, in many places, to cutting of the labia and sewing the labia together, and it's varied and extensive. I should say when I talk, and one of the reasons that I think this is very important that I talk about it with students is that there's no subject that more directly engages attention on the concept of cultural relativism, which I think is anthropology's greatest contribution to human discourse. But it focuses our attention also on the difference between cultural relativism and ethical relativism. So what cultural relativism is, not that you have to accept all cultures' practices, but that you have to understand them and get people's own explanation for them before you start passing judgment. And so I also like to mention that Indonesia is a country that has a lot of this, and I think it's important to mention that because otherwise there's a tendency to just connect it to Africa, and that's wrong. Although it's most common in spots of Africa across the Sahel, and so what they say in Pakistan is that the program takes 3 years, and they go in not talking about this, but talking about health and education and eventually about women's rights. They recruit women to their side. They put others to their side, and I remember in one interview, Molly Melching said that early on, there was a village in which she spent a lot of time, and village headman or chief spoke publicly and said, "We are not the kind of people who do this kind of thing." And then she knew that her program had been a success. I do want to mention something about the terminology because they don't use FGM. They only use female genital cutting. And what one of the leaders said about this in a letter to someone who posed the question, we must use words, and so among these options, Tostan has chosen the term female genital cutting based on what communities that are giving up the practice have told us. The term cutting allows them to accomplish more than the others because it is less judgmental and value-laden. As a result, the term is more effective for engaging groups in dialogue around this practice and eventually bringing about its end. And it goes on, let me be very, very clear. We do not use this term in an attempt to excuse or diminish the impact of the practice. I think anyone who has taken time to learn about Tostan knows that we are very far from hiding or excusing the real significant consequences of this practice. Yet, despite its serious health consequences, we have found that FGC is not done with the intent to mutilate a girl. Rather, parents and both Rev Ricotta and Dr. Young have emphasized as parents who have their daughters cut want the best for them. It seems counterintuitive, but in our experience, if there's a dominant emotion involved in FGC, it is love. And that is counterintuitive. And it, I don't know if you can fit that into the oxytocin narrative, but I had an old friend who ran an institute for conflict resolution in Northern Ireland, and she was very instrumental in helping to bring about the peace in Northern Ireland. And whenever she referred to the capital of Northern Ireland, she said Derry, Londonderry. Those are the two names. Derry is used by Catholics. Londonderry is used by Protestants. Derry, Londonderry is a very big mouthful, but she invariably said it that way, because otherwise she would have taken sides with one of the first things out of her mouth. And I started thinking today, maybe to say FGC, FGM, instead of just FGM. There is a little bit of a snag, because C could also stand for circumcision, and this really is nothing like male circumcision, as Larry pointed out. But female genital cutting is a more neutral term, and might allow us to get inside the minds of people doing that more credible.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Yeah.
Could I make a point to that? I admire Molly Melching so much. There were 3 years between the time that I started, that I was invited by Robert Aroni to come, and the bishop allowed me. I have read every single page on her website. I started by reading Half the Sky. That's how I learned it. I was devouring it. When I got to Sabay, I did call it FGC. And they didn't know what I was talking about. And so for the exact same reasons that Molly uses FGC in Senegal, I use the words that they use in Uganda. And a new thing, when we were in Tanzania, they don't call the women, they don't call them women, they say the victims. So I always try to mirror their language. Otherwise, I would still be using FGC, and in the areas where I work, nobody knows what that means. So
that suggests there's already been a lot of progress in those places for the way
Maybe
it would have to happen.
yeah.
Think about it.
Progress among some people, especially the leaders that came to our conferences. But in Meru, as I pointed out, they still said that 75% of women there in that area are still being cut. So there is, some progress being made among some people, but those people may be in leadership positions, and now those leaders all have our presentations, and they are actually giving these same teachings in their in the churches and other community places. So maybe we'll get further progress from that. Yeah.
Unfortunately, millions of women are going to be cut this year.
Yep.
And that is very hard to change.
Yep.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, wanted to thank you, Larry, for inviting me and for finding out about videos in which I appeared that I didn't even know about. I'll tell a little bit about my own history in my connectedness with this, because I've had ambivalence over the course of my career doing research on this practice for some of the reasons that Mel discussed. But let me start with just a story that has to, I think, emphasize the importance of messaging and the intrigue that I have had listening to your talk today, because I did my own doctoral research in Egypt and spent 2 years living there with the prevalence of FGMC, and I use the term that's now coined by the WHO and countries have endorsed that are engaged with the Sustainable Development Goals. But the prevalence of the practice in the aggregate was 97%. So 97% of women experiencing some form of female genital cutting or mutilation. The important thing, though, was that the form of the practice in Egypt was among the most mild. Sometimes a minor nick, and I use the word minor in relative terms, of course, a minor nick of the clitoris, perhaps some removal of the labia minora. But the initial campaigns for abandonment were focused on public health messaging. So I'm providing a critique of my own field. And those public health advocates were not really fully informed about the form of the practice that was most prevalent in this setting. And some of the health effects that have been identified with more severe forms of practice related to labor and delivery, related to severe bleeding, more often are related to more severe forms of the practice. So the public health messaging that was conveyed in an effort to support abandonment of practice was not resonating with many women in this setting. So that's an example of public health efforts that failed effectively to resonate with local populations. So in 94, 95, there was a conference in Egypt, the International Conference on Population and Development, and FGMC was raised as an international issue. In that context, an international women's rights issue, as well as a public health issue. We were just in the field collecting population-based data on the practice. We included some fairly interesting questions about FGMC, and were able to look at cohort changes in the practice by asking mothers about the experiences of each of their daughters. So we could actually look at changes in the age-specific probability of the practice by asking moms about their daughters. During the conference, a girl died from FGMC, and that created a lot of national shame and embarrassment. It also created a stir to the extent that the colleagues with whom we were working asked if we would not publish anything from the data that we were collecting on FGMC. So it's my first experience of sort of the conflict between academic freedom and censorship of politically sensitive data on practices that run the risk of major international reputational shame and damage for countries in the context of these international dialogues. So I waited to publish these data. What I already knew was that the practice was in decline among Christian minority groups in Egypt. And so in some senses, there was good news to convey, right? Because declines were underway in particular religious groups. And in some senses, not good news to convey because majority Muslim populations, we were not seeing the same kinds of decline. So this sort of contextualized affiliation of FGMC with religion as an expression of gendered identity in international context is something that has interested me for quite some time. And so Christian groups were differentiating themselves by affiliating with international agencies and funders for developmental aid, and FGMC became part of a Christian-based campaign for women's empowerment. So we eventually shared that, but I just wanted to underscore how sensitive these conversations are and how serious the implications can be for local individuals who are identified as being affiliated with practices like FGMC that suddenly become politically charged and sensitive. So I did respectfully wait to publish those findings until my colleagues in country became comfortable. But the third thing I wanted to share is our own, well, actually a student's experience who collaborated in country on a qualitative study looking at stories between husbands and wives who were identified as having different severities, the wives having different severities of FGMC. So in the Amhara region of Ethiopia, there tend to be a wide constellation of practices, including some of the most severe forms. And I really appreciated the stories that you shared from both the husbands and wives' points of view about the implications of the most severe forms of the practice for sexual pleasure, for relationship and bonding between partners. And we earned the trust of these individuals who shared their stories. And it was I had real ethical, a second round of ethical dilemmas about publishing these findings because of the extremely traumatic stories that women told who had experienced infibulation. These were traumatic stories of rape at first intercourse, of days, it requiring days to achieve penetration because of the suturing of the labia. So these were experiences that were traumatic for women, severely physically, emotionally, psychologically traumatic for women, also for their spouses who were expected as ways to express their masculinity to achieve penetration and to consummate the marriage. So traumatic experiences of rape associated with infibulation, to the point where women had extreme aversion in their partnerships, ran away. They often, in the sample, I'll speak specifically for the sample, were child brides. So were married at very young ages. So I really appreciated the stories that you have elicited about the constellation, the connection between FGMC, child marriage, and experiences of abuse and violence in marriage. I found the story that you shared today really compelling because it is a story that both men and women in heterosexual relationships can really identify with. And so that gets me back to the importance of messaging. And I am really curious to see where your work goes because of the universality of bonding and partnership and pleasure and love in the context of marriage. So I just wanted to thank you for the invitation to come and join the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I was really impressed by is, across religion, Christian, Muslim, everyone experiences love and bonding at some level, especially, women having children. And so everybody can appreciate that. They can also appreciate how mother animals, will risk their life to save their baby and to being highly, faithful to their baby. And so I think that the message, really, we didn't hear anyone sort of argue or say they did not believe, or they understood it too. And they're using the word oxytocin and dopamine. And, the science that I teach is the same science as I talk other places, but maybe I make it a little bit more relatable to someone without a biology background. But did you want to say something?
Kathryn, I'm glad you shared that about the trauma, because even before I started working with Dr. Young, I would tell people, and now he backs me up, which I love, that when a woman wants to, who's gone through FGM, when she wants to get away, when she wants to not participate in sex, it's not because, and I say this to the men, it's not because she's a bad wife or she's a disobedient wife or however you look at that. It's because God has created another hormone called cortisol, which is the fight or flight hormone. And when you feel fear, when you know that something's painful, that's a hormone that tells you this is dangerous, get away. And when I say this to men, it's one of the most intense things. You can see their face because they have sometimes beat their wife for not submitting or done something else. And many women, especially in Subay, when they have the number of children that they want, and the oldest one has grown up, because they haven't bonded to the husband the way their bodies are created to do, because she doesn't have any oxytocin, she leaves her husband alone and goes and lives with the oldest child. But that pain, when the husbands learn, when men learn that they're not only not getting that amazing dose of oxytocin when they're having the pleasure of mutually wonderful sex, his wife is getting a dose of cortisol that makes her need to either fight him or flee from him.
And that cortisol also, or the CRF, actually fights against the oxytocin, so it
Yeah,
counteracts
yeah.
it. Another message that I didn't mention here, but because we have many women in the audience who have been cut, emphasizing that it's not that you can't experience oxytocin and bonding without the clitoris, but you simply need to be cognizant. If you think about these hormones and how they act, and then engage with each other with social touch, caress, looking into the eyes, and all the things, I try to convey that whenever you feel like you have a connection with someone else, through looking into the eyes, through touching, smiling, giving a gift, eating together, doing all these kind of, that's why I show that last picture of me and my wife sitting there. But it's not that all is lost if you don't have that. It certainly, if sex is painful, then you're missing one important aspect, I think, which is the natural biology of human bonding. But there are ways of getting around that. And I think that's also an important message.
Yeah, and we give them, I have one slide that says, all is not lost. And we give them ideas of things that they can do to elicit or to release oxytocin in their wives. And the first time I did that was at a men's conference. And I told them, in the middle of the day, call your wife and say, honey, I was just thinking about you and I want to pray for you. What can I pray for you today? Or I'm going to the market. Can I get something for you? Or go home and say, you've had a long day. Go have a cup of tea with a neighbor. And the men are like, really? That would work? And the women are just like swooning. And they're like, oh, I would feel so wonderful if that happened. So I gave the men homework that first night. I always give them homework. I say, on the way home, I want you to think of the things, 3 things that you love about your wife so much you would marry her all over again. And then tell her those 3 things and come back and report to us. And when they came back the next day, there were so many adorable stories, but one man said, he was an older man. It was in his like early 70s. And he said that, well, I told my wife the 3 things. And then he just sat there and I said, come on, what happened? And he said, I was shocked. And I was like, oh no, something backfired. And he said, she looked at me and she said, why? In 30 years, have you never said that? And I've never known that's how you felt about me. And he said, I don't know why, but I'm telling you now. He said she burst into tears and put her arms around him for the first time he could ever remember. So it was just so powerful. And they all had stories like that. So yeah, it's
Yeah, and I even tell about, in my early career, thinking about oxytocin and dopamine chemistry, that I wasn't paying attention to things like giving my wife flowers. I said, oh, flowers are not going to cause love. This is oxytocin and dopamine. But then one day I realized when I give my wife flowers, I see that sparkle in her eye and the expression on her face. And then I can relate, in my mind, I can think, oh, that's the dopamine that's being released. And so I convey that message of how I changed. And, they just all look at each other and they get it. So it's something about just the knowledge of the chemistry that's going on in the brain that kind of, it adds something so that it helps guide them, gives them a rationale for doing certain things rather than a counselor just saying you should do this because the psychologist says so. I don't even tell them what they need to do, but I just give suggestions. This is what I have learned. I learned from nature and listen to nature. And I think that that's a very powerful thing. So do you want to say anything else?
Question for you. No. One of the things I'm curious about, because there's a lot of discussion in this field about resistance to change, right? Or a challenge with sustainability. Although we're seeing declines, I wanted to chat at some point about declines that we've been seeing for decades in some settings, but there are local beliefs and local sort of systems of beliefs about the body that if you don't cut a woman, the clitoris will grow into a penis.
Yeah.
If you don't cut the woman, she will be unhygienic. And hygiene is a very important principle in Islam, an extremely important principle in Islam. So have you experienced resistance among those who hold strong beliefs about the health and hygiene and purity and biology of FGMC?
That's the question. It's not resistance so much as more questions, just questions. And that's why whenever we go to a new place, and I've done this forever, I let them know that I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as a sister, and I need you to teach me before I can tell you anything. I've just got information to share. So when they tell me all of those hygiene things, and many, many more, and we get the list out, and everybody's truthful about whatever their resistant ideas would be. We address them one by one by one. And it just makes those things disappear. Like one of them, this wasn't hygiene, but at one of the conferences, a man stood up and he said, now that we've learned that these women have been really traumatized, don't you think it would be better to not go home and tell them and just leave them in ignorant bliss? And I said, there's nothing blissful about their ignorance, but you can help her by deciding together that you're not going to let this happen to your children or your grandchildren. And when they have an answer about things, like even the hygiene, sometimes I use myself as an example, and I say, do you think that I look clean? And they're, oh, yes, Reverend, yes. And I said, well, I'm not cut. Or, well, they won't be able to give birth. Well, I have 3 children. And having a person who is advocating for them, but also can speak from experience, has helped a lot.
Now, one of the comments that I thought you were going to tell the story in Tanzania, the man one of the gatekeepers of tradition, when he stood up and said, hey, not too long ago, we wore a completely different kinds of clothes, right? And we have changed our clothes. And then sometimes culture needs to change. This is after I talked about how I changed my culture, things that I eat so that I can live longer. I really want to live a long life. And so they got that. But I think the most powerful thing for us, the way we're doing it, is that we're speaking to a limited number of people when we go. All of those then are the ones that are carrying that message from within the community to the other people in the community. So, I'm not sure, how much resistance they face after they leave us and then go there. But I think it's going to be much easier if it's coming from within the community. So they're actually teaching the oxytocin dopamine bonding stuff in hundreds of churches there.
So I'm a social scientist by training, and I'm thinking about the incredible social network analysis that you could do to see how this message diffuses from leadership through their church organizations and perhaps diffuses out into the community. I think this is a really interesting transition to try to document.
You are
and-
welcome,
And it would
Kathryn.
be, it would be an important one to do.
Come with us.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I actually am very interested in trying to understand is what are the opportunities for research? I can see that my research here, my lab research here at Emory can have some big impact there, but I think that there is a opportunity for many collaborations. You can think about among, say, members of the Department of Psychiatry, where these women, we did experiments several years ago here, Andy Miller and Charlie Nemiroff and Christine Heim, looking at women who experienced sexual abuse as a child and looking at their brain oxytocin levels as adults, and they have lower levels of oxytocin as adults. But there's a lot of work being done, the Grady Trauma Project and things like that. And if there was anyone in psychiatry that was interested in doing some kind of, maybe some comparative work, looking at different tribes that have different practices and things like that from a psychiatric perspective, but also from anthropological, global health, and sociology, there's lots of opportunities here. So I'm hoping that we can continue to do this. We've done it 2 more times, and one of the challenges is to be able to have this impact. It takes funding to be able to bring the people from these far distances to have the venue and the location and things like that. So that's one of the things that at least sort of an immediate hurdle is to be able to continue to do this. But then I would love to be able to grow the sort of academic research opportunity around that. That would be great. Mel?
So I just wanted to clarify, since you mentioned Islam, Dr. Yount, that Islam, as you know, does not require or encourage these practices. As far as we know, they existed for centuries, if not millennia, before Islam came to Africa, but Islam didn't confront them and prohibit them both ways.
I'm so glad you said that, Mel, because you remember seeing the picture of Larry with the imams? There was a slide that he had when we were in Sabay, and there were 2 imams there, but one of them was the Qadi. He was the bishop of all the imams in the entire region of Sabay. And he was at a meeting of the clan leaders that our director of operations, Delmark Mangusho, went to. And I said, if you can be the last one to speak, recency effect. And so he was the last one to speak, and he said, we're going to be having this men's conference, and here's what people have done that has made them decide to stop. And he talked about oxytocin and bonding. And the Qadi came up to Delmark after that meeting, and he said, I have been, he's Muslim. He says, I have been looking for a way to stop this in my community. And he said, I've never heard that argument. He said, why can't I come to that men's meeting? And so I had already said to Delmark, invite them to come. So we had 75 imams that came to that conference. And Larry wasn't there then, but he spoke to them because we had made some videos, little 6 clips, and he was able to speak. And they, the team there, unpacked it all. So yeah, it is something that there are Muslim people who, even though it's not required by the Quran has a few places that speak about the inferiority of women that have been used to say, well, then, so those are things that this COTI is now able to address. So we're really happy about that.
That's right. Yeah, I would just agree wholeheartedly that FGMC has been observed in a wide range of religious communities. So it would not be specific to Islam or to Christianity, but has appeared in contextual ways with interpretations and belief systems that are more local. So I did want to clarify that. I think that's an important point to raise.
And in talking to people about why this arose originally, like in many of the pastoral communities where the men go with their cattle and sheep for 2 months away from the village, and their wives are there, they sort of, I think maybe originally this was felt as a way of keeping the wife faithful, so that the husband knows that this must be his children. So there's that perspective. But I will say, although I felt like we never got any pushback from the whole oxytocin bonding kind of thing, we always got pushback a little bit from when you were talking about equality of men and women. That's something that's a little bit much harder to push, but I think it also speaks to, so those are two different things that are very culturally based. But we would often get feedback, pushback from the idea that men and women are equal or something like that. And but much less so than about this biology. It just didn't happen. So anyway, did you guys want to have any other? Have anything else to say?
I really appreciate what you're doing. I'll say that. World is going to be a better place.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for participating and having this discussion, and thanks everyone for attending, and thanks Patty for coming down from Boston for this, and great discussion, I think. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Does anybody want to have? Anybody have any questions? Was it 6:30?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Have any data on that?
Yeah, I don't know the rates of
I can tell you everything.
I don't know the rates of mortality from FGMC, but one of the challenges actually with the trends towards abandonment is that as people have learned about some of the health effects, there has been a movement towards medicalization of the practice.
Yeah.
So I don't have figures on mortality related to FGMC, but I will say that knowledge of the health risks has led to medicalization, and not just medicalization with customary practitioners using more hygienic practices, but actually medicalization where MDs and doctors are practicing on the side. And there are economics of the practice that are very complicated.
Yes.
And I think are important things to address because the practitioners are often women and it's a source of income for those women. But also many physicians in practicing settings aren't earning incomes and often have second jobs in the private sector. So there's a sort of a political economy of this that I think is important to recognize. So that's away from your question. I don't know mortality rates, but concerns about the health effects have led to a movement to sustain the practice without the same health effects. And things like that.
I don't know the number, but they are there. I was speaking to one of our colleagues in Tanzania last week, and she was saying that it's far more prevalent than people think. But they have myths for why it happened. We talked about how Larry said how a girl might have looked with lust at a boy, or maybe, and it's very shaming. The girl dies, and her shame continues on after her death for no good reason, but the family is also shamed. And sometimes they say, well, the goddess didn't care for this particular girl, so she wouldn't accept her and she let her die. Or they'll say all kinds of things, because other than it shouldn't have happened. And that one of the things that Domily does, the nurse, she talks about how it happens because these people have no experience, and you cut an artery and you can't stop it. So thanks for the question.
Any other question? Arlie?
That science is very powerful in helping people understand maybe the consequences of those acts and everything. Do you think scientists have a responsibility to communicate their science maybe outside of specific publication and make our discovery more accessible to the general population? Because we have a tendency of like just communicating amongst ourselves. Do you think this is something that we need to change and address to make sure that that type of knowledge about oxytocin, for example, can be more easily accessible?
Who wants to answer that?
I absolutely want to.
Okay.
I'm so glad you brought that up. There's controversy about the extent to which scholars and academics step across the line and begin to advocate, even from an evidence base of their own research. Our group is actually, and this is another reason why I'm so glad you brought up the constellation of violent practices. Our group has moved from observational research over many years into intervention research, and have developed social norms-based programs that we are delivering to promote the primary prevention of certain forms of violence, sexual violence in particular. And having demonstrated efficacy of those programs, we are very interested in something called implementation science, where you work with institutions and entities to try to support the dissemination of the programming to bring it to scale. So we're now involved in a national implementation trial where we have partnered with multiple entities in Vietnam for violence prevention programming. And I wanted to plant that seed because I can imagine modules being created with your work that could be disseminated at scale. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, so related to that, the couple, the gynecologist and the nurse, Damali and Antabat, who helped organize those hospital conferences, they've just started the first Uganda-wide health news channel, because they felt that there's not a good source of information about health. And so they're doing all kinds of health related stuff on that channel. And sometime over the next month or so, I'm going to do a recorded video session, sort of like what I did at in that news program. By the way, that if we were to watch the rest of that, you would be able to see a lot of the nurses and things that they said that one of the things that they got out of this was it's not about FGM, but really about, even they should not treat the patient so mechanically, but treating them as a human being and eliciting oxytocin that might help the healing power. So there's a larger message there. And anyway, yeah, so we're going to be filming that, and then that will be sort of looping from time to time on that station. But yeah, so this was one of the big hesitancies of me getting involved in this, because it is so different from what I normally do. I normally, try to give talks and try to be, as technical and, talk about the scientific advances that we've made. But I do see that there's so much value in what we have learned that can be communicated in not such a technical way, but that can help, sort of change the way people think about the way they behave, not telling people what they should or should not do, but to help them give something to imagine that will help them guide their behaviors. So I think that's what's so powerful about this.
So I was gonna say in terms of spreading scientific evidence, I don't want to get you in more trouble, Dr. Ricotta, Reverend Ricotta. But there is evidence, I think it's pretty good evidence, that the best way to spend a development aid dollar is on educating girls. You educate a girl to increase her lifetime income, her health quality, her children's health, her children's education, her husband's health. And the ramifications are amazing. I've listed them all, but that is very good.
Thank you for bringing that up because we know that. And from the very first conference we had in Sabay, Delmart Mangusho kept pushing me. You can't just love them and leave them. You can't just tell these girls and these men and women this story and then not help them. The girls are lifted up. They're empowered to learn this message. But in order to keep that power, they need economic help. So we got a small grant from the Finnish government, and we started 11 groups where we took girls whose parents signed a contract saying they will not force their girls to be cut. And we taught them sewing skills. And we taught hairdressing skills. And we've built 3 bakeries, so they're making commercial bread. And what has happened is that these girls are so empowered now that their fathers don't want to marry them off early. Because once in these areas, if a girl gets married, everything she produces belongs to the husband's family, no longer to the father's family. But a father is incentivized to have her girl cut and then married very soon because he gets a higher bride price for a cut girl, or he did, not so much now. And he'll have money. There's no Social Security there. Your bride price for your daughter is part of your Social Security. So when the girl has a skill that she's bringing money into the family, it makes all the difference. And so we're not just giving them the information. We have 26 groups now because it takes time. Again, like money, you have to provide the money, but the stories are so amazing of how these little sewing groups have changed girls' lives. They're making school uniforms, and you need school uniforms day in, day out, year after year. So they're making good money. They're cutting hair. They're baking bread. It's a really helpful thing. So I'm glad you brought that up now. Because these girls, we're educating them. The girls who schooling is very, very, very expensive there, but giving them an education that empowers their economic viability has been one of the greatest gifts, joys in my life.
Okay, with that, I think we will finish. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks everybody on the Zoom for tuning in. And thank you guys for taking part in this. Thank you.